Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for this second Brainwaves webinar on active listening and using the later framework for better student mental health. My name's Tracy and I'm your host for this afternoon. Today I'm delighted to be joined by a very experienced panel in terms of working with students and supporting student mental health. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Sue Roffey. Sue is a psychologist, academic, speaker and author on student wellbeing, relationships, behaviour and social and emotional learning. She is an honorary associate professor at UCL, an associate fellow at Western Sydney University and director of Growing Great Schools Worldwide. Sue is also a proponent of the later framework, which we'll be talking about today. Welcome, Sue.
Pleased to be here.
Joining Sue today, I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Hart. Rachel is Head of Life Advice and PSHE at the Lady Eleanor Hollis School in London. She has a postgraduate diploma in adolescent and family mental health from the Tavistock Clinic and is a member of the Coalition for Youth Mental Health in Schools. Rachel is also a member of the Brainwaves Teacher Advisory Board. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Tracy. Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
And finally, I'd just like to introduce Julian Turner, who is going to moderate the Q&A session at the end for us. Julian is the head of the education programme here at Brainwaves. He is the deputy chairman of The Day, the online student newspaper that turns news into lessons. He was previously chair of the governing board of a London school rated outstanding for leadership and management. Hi, Julian.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And just so you know who they are, if you see their names, we have Shivani from The Day looking after you today on the chat. And we have Claire, who is our producer, looking after things behind the scenes. So the format for today, we've got a number of questions about active listening that we'd like to ask Sue, Rachel and Julian. And then for the last minutes or so, 15 minutes or so, we can open up the floor so that you can ask some more questions too. Before we start though, what we're going to do is ask you a couple of questions yourself. You don't have to take part in the survey if you're not in a teaching role, but if you are, please just click on your answers. So let's get those polls started, if that's okay. The first question we'd like to ask is, how confident do you feel talking to a student who is suffering with mental ill health? We have 4 options for you to choose from: very confident, quite confident, somewhat confident, or not at all confident. And I'm just going to check that you are able to see those polls okay. How is that going?
No, it's not come up.
Okay, let me try and restart that. There we go.
It needs you to do it, yeah.
Okay, there we go. So there's the first question there about how confident you feel talking to a student. And then once you've answered that, there is a second question about how much you know specifically about active learning as a strategy for supporting student mental health. So I'll just give you a few moments to answer those 2 questions and choose your responses. Thank you for taking part in that. If you're clicking on your response, just give you a few minutes more, not minutes, seconds. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll there and share the results with you. So there we go. What are we looking at? So how confident do you feel about talking to a student who is suffering with mental ill health? Quite confident, 46%, somewhat confident, 42%, and not at all confident, 13%, and 0 very confident. So that's revealing in itself. And then how much do you know about active listening as a strategy? 21% have not heard of it, 46% have heard but not using it, and 33% some experience of using it. Okay, and non-using it regularly. So that's really, really helpful in terms of knowing where you are and your knowledge about active listening. So what we're going to do now then is move on to our panel. So let's make a start. So first off, I think it's really important that we all have a good understanding of what active listening is and what active listening isn't. So Sue, might you be able to kick us off by outlining some of the principles of active listening as a tool for supporting well-being?
I mean, one of the things that's really important is that we do have a large number of young people now who don't feel that they matter, they don't feel valued. And one of the ways we can actually help them feel more valued and promote their mental health is to actually listen to what they are saying to us. Now, an awful lot of teachers, I think, an awful lot of adults believe that they're good listeners. And in fact, not that many people do actually practice active listening. I was once involved in teaching school counsellors on a training course, and we did a session on active listening. And I had one student go away, and I said, please practice it with your friends. And he went away and he came back and said, I'm not sure I'm doing that again. He says, I couldn't get a word in edgeways, because active listening actually encourages people to speak about what really, really matters to them. And what often happens is that listening is something that disappears because people talk rather than listen. And that's why I'm going to be talking about the later framework, because the later framework is a framework in which young people will feel that they're listened to. And one of the reasons I'm doing that is that I went to a conference where somebody spoke about the fact that young people often go to an adult when they're in crisis, or they sometimes go to an adult when they're in crisis. And very, very, very few of them think that that interaction with that adult is useful to them. And I think that that's why Michael Tunnicliffe developed the late framework, and I have amended that to be the later framework, and we'll talk about that in a while.
Okay, so are you able to outline some of the basic principles then, that we can just get a grasp of what active listening is?
Well, I mean, it's probably going to be covered pretty much during the talk that I'm going to be giving on later, if that's all right with you. And
Sure.
I will go into some detail then.
Okay, great. Why do you think active listening is something that matters today, Rachel?
I think it especially matters today, post-pandemic, when we have seen the horrifying increase in mental health conditions amongst our young people. If you look at the statistics, 50% of mental health problems are now established by year 9. So we have swathes of teenage students who aren't, as Sue says, aren't feeling heard, aren't feeling understood. And if we can help them to feel heard and understood, and if we can try and erase those feelings of isolation that were brought about by lockdown and by the pandemic, I think we can make some really positive steps towards helping their mental health.
Okay, great. So do you want to go ahead and just talk a little bit about the later framework then that you've worked upon?
I will. I'm just going to share my screen here.
Okay, great.
If I may find. Right. Has everybody got this?
Yep, we can see that.
Okay.
Are you able to go to slideshow there so we can see the full screen?
Yes, hold on a second.
Great, thanks.
Is that all right?
Perfect.
Lovely.
Okay. The first thing about listening is that you give it your full attention, which means that you do not look at your phone, your watch. You actually pay attention to the person who's in front of you. And the most important thing, I think, is that you do not think that this is an opportunity to give good advice, because that is often... Teachers, most adults, are kind human beings. They want to do something to help. And what they often do is that they, first of all, they say, well, when this happened to me, this was helpful to me, or perhaps what you should be doing is. And what happens when you are not engaged in active listening, what you do is that you shut down the other person. If you find that you're having a conversation with a Tracy, you've got your hand up. Does that mean you want to?
Oh goodness, sorry, I didn't realize I'd done that. My apologies.
Just wondered if there was something going amiss somewhere.
My apologies.
Is that you don't interrupt them, you don't give them advice, you don't say if I were you. The second thing, which is incredibly important, is that you acknowledge and validate what your students are telling you and what their feelings are. Now, what you might be thinking is, this isn't really very important, or, you know, it won't be a problem in a little while. But if a young person does not feel that their concerns, the things that are overwhelming them, are not validated, then again, you shut them down. The other part of acknowledgement is you acknowledge how they're feeling. And you can do that by just saying, tell me more. Yeah, that's tough. Absolutely. So for the first L and the L is listening with your full attention, not interrupting, not giving advice. The A is to acknowledge and validate both the situations and the emotions that the young person is bringing to you. Now, T is a difficult one. It's for talk, but you don't talk at, you talk with. Talking here is mostly about asking good questions. It's to ask the young person, well, what have you thought of in terms of what you might do about that? Young people in education these days are not given enough opportunities to develop problem-solving skills. So one of the things that happens here is you actually ask them to lay out what they've already thought of doing. And at this point, you might actually make a few suggestions. Maybe have you thought of, or maybe there is something else that, you know, that you might have thought of. So you go to some detail with them. You might say, which person in your family is somebody that you might want to share this with? So they are identifying a range of alternatives at this point. And then the E is for encouraging that young person to take a safe option. Now, one of the reasons Michael Tunnicliffe developed this is because of the young people who were coming to him with suicidal ideation, thinking that life wasn't worth living, and that they, you know, they hadn't got any other options but to you know, take some very severe and serious measures. And what you need to do here is say, yes, that's really, really tough, but there will be other things, and what might be a safe option for you. Now, what Michael Tunnicliffe didn't do is that he didn't actually add R for review. I don't think that you can just leave it there if you've got a young person in distress in front of you. You need to be saying, you know, can you come and have a chat with me tomorrow and see how it goes, or at the end of the week? It will depend on how concerned you are. One of the things that I have read recently is that very often young people go to their peers, they go to their friends to ask them for advice. And one of the things in response to that is, I think that every single adolescent should be learning this framework so that they have a strategy when this happens. What often happens is that that young person will say, well, you need to tell an adult. And then that person might go and talk to an adult, and that adult might not know how to listen appropriately. So for me, active listening needs to be something that everybody knows how to do, to encourage a young person to believe that their concerns are valid, that they're being taken seriously, that they are being heard, and that somebody is on their side and helping them maybe think through all the alternatives that they might have. I'm wondering whether anybody has any contributions to make to what I've just said, or issues that they might want to raise. Rachel?
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned there the importance of peer support. And at LEH, we have set up a peer support system, a program, and we've used the Anna Freud model to do that. And that very much is teaching. We've trialed it with our current upper six. So these are the students who are they're in the year 13. They are the students who statistically were most affected by pandemic and by lockdown. 14 to 15-year-old girls, I teach at a girls' school, were those most affected by what happened. And it's an opportunity that they feel to give back, and they are really listening to other students talk about experience that they've had and that are more relevant. So students are going to them more readily than to members of staff, because
Yes.
their experiences are more valid, they're more recent. And as you said, our upper six are being taught those skills of active listening. They're being taught to look out for this non-verbal communication. And they probably are in a position to recognize it more readily than we as adults are, what that non-verbal communication is telling them, because they're living in the same environment. They're encouraged to ask open questions, they're encouraged to paraphrase, and they're encouraged to, as you said, you know, when you're talking through options, we use the change sheet, the Anna Freud change sheet, which is, you know, asking their peers, what's the problem, what's the situation like now, what are you feeling? So it's encouraging emotional articulacy. How does it make you feel? What could you do to make it better? So it's signposting, but it's also trying to tease out solutions from the student themselves and different options of solutions. So it links into that problem solving skill, as you say, Sue, that we need to encourage our young people to have, and it really reinforces emotional resilience, and it really benefits well-being for both the peer mentor and also the student accessing the service.
Absolutely. I think that one of the issues around problem solving and looking through options that are available, it's also maybe asking students to think about, you know, what are the pros of this option and what are the cons, you know, so that they've actually got some way of choosing something that is that might work for them. The other thing I feel that is quite useful is to ask the young person, you know, who in your life thinks you're special, who thinks you're worthwhile, and tune them into that, because quite often we know what's happened in the pandemic is that a lot of our young people feel very isolated, they don't feel connected, and if we can try and encourage them to think about who might be the person who's you might best try and connect with, who be a support to you, somebody who would believe in you and be concerned for you. Young people often let themselves go into some depths of their imagination about how awful it is. We know in resilience that intelligence is only a protective factor if it's used constructively. We know lots of intelligent people who in a way go down rabbit holes. They think how awful it is and how much worse it's going to be, and it's sometimes a difficult skill to balance the validation of a young person's situation and telling them that for them that certainly is something that they are struggling with, without saying, I know how you feel. Not a good idea, because you don't. But also helping them to maybe think around and through in a more constructive way the options that are around for them and the things that might be the positive things in their life, without sort of saying, you know, look on the bright side, which is not a good idea.
Is there a certain age range, Sue, that this type of framework works best with? Rachel mentioned that, you know, they train their upper six students. Is it a case that you do need them to be slightly older to understand the process, or can you use it with slightly younger children as well?
My experience of primary school children is that we often really, really underestimate them. We underestimate their ability to do these sorts of things. I think if they're given good experiential activities, so if you have an activity, I do social and emotional learning across all ages, and if you have an activity in which somebody is listening, you ask in pairs, you ask them to take a turn about listening to somebody, nodding and encouraging them to talk about something that's important to them, and then you say, now stop listening, and they look away or they interrupt. it, and people suddenly begin to understand in a very powerful way what it means when people don't listen. So having young people learning to have conversations, learning to listen to each other, can begin actually not necessarily with this sort of framework about major mental distress, but certainly terms in how they learn to listen properly to each other can start at a much younger age than we expect, actually, I would say, certainly in primary school.
Yes, I'd agree that mindful listening, the active listening, is a skill that can be taught from very young. I know that in terms of supporting peers, I know the Anna Freud suggests that not younger than 10 years old to be in that position. And I've also got a question here about how we protect our peer mentors from disclosures and hearing information that might be distressing. And I think if somebody sets up a peer support network at a school, then I think having an opportunity for a supervision, or having, obviously there needs to be a program facilitator, that person needs to be available for students to access, and we've spoken a lot about safeguarding, a lot about confidentiality, so that would need to be borne in mind if somebody was setting that up in school. Absolutely, protecting and recognizing that students might hear things that might upset them. Yeah,
I think you're raising a really important issue there, Rachel, because I think confidentiality is one of the reasons that people are hesitant about going and talking to anybody. They're scared that what they might say might go further. But at the same time, we also know that because of safeguarding measures, you can never say to a student, what's said in this room will go no further. That's not, if somebody's being hurt, it needs to be taken further. But at the same time, you don't have to make a meal out of it and sort of say, I'll take what you say really, really seriously. And if you need that extra support, we'll both think about the best person to provide that.
Sue, can I ask you a question? I think for many teachers who are often very good communicators, they would see active listening as being just a sort of part of what they would call good communication skills. And it feels, they might feel that what we're saying is sort of is common sense in a sense. So could you just talk a bit about what the difference it makes to actually regard this as a piece of training that is needed to be done in order to develop a skill?
I know that teachers are good communicators. But most of their communication tends to be in the direction of teacher towards student rather than the other way around. A lot of my work has been in behaviour, and I do talk with teachers about what they might do when a young person is having a bit of a meltdown, because punishing them is a hiding to nothing. It doesn't work. And what often happens is that teachers will say, what's the matter? Tell me what's the matter. And what is going on at that moment is the amygdala, the part of the brain that deals with freeze, flight or fight. It goes into action very much faster than the neocortex, the thinking part of the brain, which means that when a young person is in a state of meltdown, usually because of a threat that they've recognized, often because that threat mirrors a threat that they've had in their life before, often a threat to their sense of self, they are not able to think straight. Okay, so the most important thing at that time is not to accentuate the threat so that you don't thrust your face or your fingers closer to them, but you take a step back. And the first thing you do is validate the emotion.
Yeah.
Say, I can see you're really upset, And once that emotion has been validated, then it's worth saying something that's active to that young person. Would you like to have a drink of water? Would you like to go and sit down? Something that is active rather than stop this nonsense. and then you follow it up afterwards, because a young person cannot have that conversation when they're in that state. But the conversation that you have afterwards might be around the real active listening, which is, tell me what's going on here. I'm here to listen. And I think that active listening does take a bit of time, and quite often teachers, and I would imagine that that's something that will be raised in the chat, you know, to do this active listening when you've got a class of others, students to attend to, is quite hard. So finding when you do it and finding that time, and at which point you realize that this has to take priority, is also an important part of the whole brief.
In your experience, both of you, Rachel and Sue, do you think it's easier to help young people develop this skill than to help the adults develop it?
That's a really good
go
question.
first, Rachel.
I think that's a really good question. I think that, yeah, I mean, there's clearly the plasticity in our brains when we're young, right? And I think that also, I think that young people are growing up with a greater vocabulary around mental health, and they're growing up with a greater awareness of the difficulties that they are experiencing, that they're seeing in others. And there's a willingness, I think, to try and support. And I think that we've seen, certainly in all those massive societal changes that we've experienced in the last few years, the sense of solidarity and community amongst our young people is coming through. So I think, yes, I think the willingness is certainly there, and the openness to learn those skills is there. I would say so, yes.
I mean, I think I'd like to acknowledge at this moment that there are teachers working in schools who are turning children's lives around. They're actually making a real difference to some young people. And you can see how important that was as a result of the pandemic, when a lot of people, a lot of students who are reliant on that warmth and predictability and reliability of teachers suddenly didn't have it anymore. And I think that teachers don't get acknowledged anywhere near as much as they need to for making the difference that they actually make to young people. On the other hand, there are also some teachers whose ideology is about getting good test scores, and they don't necessarily believe that their role and their job is to listen in the way that we're talking about today. Hopefully there aren't many of them, but I think in secondary schools where subject matters have precedence to student matters, sometimes that does happen. I don't know what you think about that, Rachel.
Well, I think it's very kind of you to acknowledge the impact that teachers can have on students. I think that we in schools are so pressed for time. We're so time poor, and I think active listening, if you're really going to impact a child, then you need the time to do that. And often in our days, we don't have that time. I do think that where parental choice is a factor, I think parents are choosing schools more and more now based on not just academic results, but based on the kindness of the environment and on the pastoral care that school offers, where there's an element of choice. And I appreciate that not many parents are in that position, but I do think that's becoming increasingly a factor in parental choice in schools.
I would agree with that, and the research is now saying that more parents are concerned about the well-being of their children than they are about high test scores.
Rightly so.
Absolutely. Somebody tell the government, please.
Very good. Well, we'll try and encourage some people to submit some questions to you both now, whether it's about using the framework for their own benefit and use with students, or whether it's about encouraging students to adopt this approach as well. If you want to ask a question, the best way to do that is to click on the Q&A button that's on your menu bar at the bottom of the screen, and if you can type in any questions that you might have, then we can put those to Sue and Rachel. In the meantime, I just might ask Sue and Rachel if they have any sort of top tips for how they would encourage active listening throughout the school, both with students and with with teachers. Sue, have you got anything that you would like to say, you know, try this, this is my takeaway from what we've learned so far?
I think that one of the things that is obviously a big issue, as Rachel has mentioned, is how time poor teachers are. You know, they're trying to fit quarts into pint pots, if that's a very old-fashioned analogy here. But I think if teachers actually talk together, and those who choose to do so make themselves available maybe half an hour a week, in a specific place, and say, my door is open at this time for anybody who wants to talk to me, and that's and they actually follow the later framework here, then teachers will not feel overwhelmed by suddenly having to respond to something in a crisis. It's about saying, these are the times when I am going to be there and available, and that might actually make life a bit easier, and also give students a sort of a knowledge about who is there and when they're there, and pupils can encourage their peers to go and talk to these trained people. That's just one thought. The other is social emotional learning is not given as much priority in schools as it needs to have, for all sorts of reasons. And teaching students things like a language for emotions, and you could do this from the early years onwards, you know, in a different sort of way, but also giving students agency to talk about things like, you know, when I'm feeling, you know, really down in the dumps, you know, this is what we like to do. So getting kids to talk in pairs, not individually, because it's not so safe, in pairs about what cheers them up when they're really down. So they have lots and lots of opportunities to talk about issues in their lives in a safe, solution focused space. It needs to be those things that are too personal in social and emotional learning and not safe either for the students themselves or for the teachers, who might fear opening Pandora's box, and they're not having the time or the resources or the training to deal with it. So if people would actually like to look at the Circle Solutions work I do, it's based in a pedagogy that is safe and solution focused.
We've had a question, Tracy, from Abdullah, who is working in Turkey, and of course where there's been the devastating earthquakes affecting many schools, students, friends, teachers and relatives, and he's asking for advice and thinking about going back to the classroom, and how one might start to talk about this issue. So it's a real live example where there is a real clear distress and need to share, and presumably, Sue, these principles really would be very helpful in creating a structured environment for those sorts of conversations.
They would, but don't forget that these young people have experienced major trauma here, and I think that one of the things that you actually see, and you know, just watching, you know, some of the news, if you can actually bear to watch it, is the it's people pulling together, people supporting each other, people feeling that this is something that we're all in together. So the issues that cause a lot of our kids, a lot of their mental health concerns, particularly anxiety about not being good enough, or, you know, being in competition with each other and being losers, disappear at times like this, because what's really important is the collaboration, the being in this all together. It's how we support each other. And these issues of change and loss are just so significant for these young people. They are also significant for some of our other young people who are also experiencing trauma. And I think that we should bear that in mind. It's not necessarily the same trauma as an earthquake, but some of our young people are experiencing abuse, some of them are experiencing family violence, some of them are experiencing things that are actually pretty, not just stressful, but traumatic. And we need to validate what's happening to them and say that, you know, we are here to hear what they have to say and help them find some way through. Rachel.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned earlier, didn't I, the isolation of the past few years on young people is what's caused so much damage, and the sense of togetherness and community that can bring strength. I mean, when we work with the Youth Mental Health Coalition, we interviewed A Place to Be, and they said that the single most important factor in protecting our young people from mental health issues is having high quality peer relationships. So just that notion of support and having a safe space in which to talk, and acknowledging feelings of grief and of loss, as you say, and providing a vocabulary if one needs to be provided to help structure those conversations respectfully.
Rachel, could you?
So I was also saying that resilience is based in a number of things. High expectations, peer relationships is one of them. A sense of belonging is really one of the major pillars of resilience, but also having somebody who believes in you, who thinks that you have got the skills and the competencies and the strengths to manage difficulties, and to you're a worthwhile person who's worth your time.
There's another question being asked by Finola. Rachel, I was going to start with you. She's asking about the different communication preferences, habits, styles, different approaches to disclosure between boys and girls, and wonder what your experience of that was, and how you think that you can work in order to is your school single sex? Actually,
it's very interesting and topical question. I actually think my counterpart at the boys' school next door is present in the audience today, so
right.
you might post something in the chat. I work very closely. I'm at a girls' school. I work very closely with the boys' school next door, and certainly the peer mentors that we have come together across both schools and are about to be delivering sessions across both schools. So so boys and girls going into classrooms here at the girls' school next door at the boys' school, delivering sessions on topics that both the boys and the girls have felt to be important. Actually, they're going to be currently working on safe internet use. My experience is that the framework for communicating is as accessible for boys and for girls, and the need is as great across both. And whilst there might be more reluctance in certain areas, I have found it to be successful on both sides.
Sue?
Yes, my experience is that if you the social emotional learning I do is mixing students up all the time, several times in a session, so that they're sitting not next to the people that they are their best mates, but and then finding things that they have in common. It can be very simple things, really. And I think we need to start. I'm fed up to the back teeth of seeing people talk about that we need to vet policemen better. We need to be talking about how we support respectful relationships from, you know, early years onwards on a regular basis, so that boys have the vocabulary to talk about feelings, they feel comfortable talking about feelings, they are concerned about developing healthy relationships for themselves and the people around them. And when that happens in a regular way, then we're going to see real changes in our society in the future. At the moment, it's being left to chance, and that's not good enough.
Thanks, Sue. Thank you, Rachel, for your thoughts on those. And thank you to Abdullah and Finola for their questions. So before we've got we finished today. What I do want to do is run the second survey. So just going to launch that now. You'll just bear with me one moment. There we go. So the question is, how confident are you feeling now about potentially using active listening as a tool for supporting student mental health? Love to hear your thoughts on those three options, whether you're confident, quite confident, or very confident. If you'd like to give a response there, that would be great. And in the meantime, what I'm going to do is give a huge thank you to our panelists for their time and expertise today. It's been a very helpful and interesting discussion. Thank you, Sue, Rachel, and Julian. I'm just returning to the poll. Okay, fantastic. Oh, that's great news. Let me share the results with you. So we have 60% of you are saying you're quite confident and 40 saying you're very confident, which is a wonderful number and statistic to see. So that's fantastic. Just wanted to say one last thing, and that was it, leading on from the point that yes, you are, as teachers, if you're joining us today as a teacher, very time poor, and so we do appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Hopefully it's been a useful session for you, and we'd love to see you at our next webinar, which is going to be on Wednesday the 1st of March at the same time, 4:15 p.m, and we're going to be talking specifically then about wellbeing champions and how they can be used for peer support. So what we'll do is we'll send you a link to register for this webinar in our follow-up email. So please do join us again then if you can. I think the details are just there. So thank you again to everybody. Thank you, panelists. And we'll look forward to seeing you again very soon. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.